The cabin lights glowed soft and golden, reflecting against polished wood panels and leather seats that seemed untouched by time. In that suspended air of luxury, silence broke the moment Eli Monroe and his younger brother Jamie stepped into the business class cabin. Their presence was ordinary enough, two boys carrying nothing more than a worn backpack and a small wooden case. Yet the rainbow pin fastened to each of their jackets became a flare in the room. A symbol of pride, small in size but heavy with meaning, seemed to pull the eyes of every passenger. The atmosphere shifted, sharp and charged, as though an invisible curtain of judgment had dropped. Among the passengers sat Veronica Hargrave, a real estate tycoon whose face had graced countless magazines. Her fortune was legendary, her influence wider than most senators, and her disdain for anyone unlike her was equally well known. Her gaze fell on the brothers like a blade. She leaned back, adjusting her diamond bracelet, lips curling into a sneer that cut deeper than any word. Her voice rang out, slicing the stillness. She demanded that the flight attendants move her immediately. "I don't spend tens of thousands of dollars to sit beside this kind of people. Change my seat, or I will speak directly to the airline's CEO." Her tone was laced with authority, the kind that had forced boardrooms into silence. It rippled across the cabin, drawing eyes, whispers, and awkward coughs. The weight of her status was undeniable, and in that moment, even the crew bent under it. The lead attendant, rather than defending the dignity of all passengers, let out a shallow laugh, a bow disguised as customer service. "Of course, Mrs. Hargrave. We will make sure you are as comfortable as possible." His words were syrup, sweet on the surface, poisoned underneath. Eli and Jamie froze. Their movements slowed as though gravity had tripled around their seats. The two sat stiffly, backs locked straight against the leather, while the world around them seemed to shrink into a circle of stairs. Veronica's eyes lingered on them like a warning, as though their very existence in this cabin was an intrusion. Yet Eli's gaze betrayed something else. Beneath the quiet, beneath the forced composure, his eyes sparked with the faintest ember of fire. Every detail of the moment stung. The hush of passengers afraid to speak, the smirk of a billionaire wielding power as a weapon, the compliant grin of an attendant too willing to please. For Jamie, only 16 and carrying dreams too delicate for this kind of violence, the silence was its own wound. For Eli, 18 and already tested by a world that demanded proof of his worth, it was fuel. The cabin became a stage where power and prejudice played out in front of those too polite to intervene. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, pretending to adjust their seatbelts, their eyes darting away to avoid responsibility. Others allowed a hint of satisfaction to play on their lips, echoing Veronica's superiority with silent approval. The air conditioning hummed steadily, but it could not cool the heat of humiliation spreading across the boys' faces. As Eli stared forward, jaw tight, his silence spoke louder than a scream. He knew what Jamie felt, the sting of being reduced to an inconvenience, a spectacle, a problem to be solved rather than a person deserving of respect. His hand clenched briefly on the armrest, nails digging into leather. Not from fear, but from resolve. He would not erupt. Not yet. The fire inside him needed the right moment, and that moment had not arrived. What unfolded in those few minutes was more than a wealthy woman demanding privilege. It was the portrait of an old prejudice wrapped in modern clothing, a reminder that money and influence can still try to dictate whose humanity is honored and who is erased. Yet, as often in history, the arrogance of power plants the seed of its own undoing. This was only the beginning of the flight, but already the sky above seemed to hold its breath, as if it knew that what began as humiliation would not end in silence. And for you watching, this is only the start of a story that will climb higher, fall harder, and prove that truth always finds a way to pierce through prejudice. Stay with us on Heart Stories, where stories of injustice, resilience, and triumph remind us that dignity cannot be bought, and silence will never erase truth. Because sometimes the most ordinary seats on a plane become the stage for extraordinary justice. The service began as if nothing had happened. Trays clinking softly and glasses filled with expensive wine, but the tension in the air never lifted. Jamie kept his small notebook balanced on his lap, its pages crowded with calculations, sketches, and careful lines that had taken weeks of late nights to complete. He held it as though it were a shield, something fragile that could preserve his dignity when words and stares had already tried to strip it away. Eli sat beside him, still as stone, his eyes fixed on the narrow aisle where the attendants moved back and forth. The moment came swiftly, casual in its cruelty. As the cart rolled to their row, one of the attendants leaned down with a polished smile that didn't reach his eyes. With a subtle flick of the wrist, the bread roll he carried slipped from the tray and landed squarely at Jamie's feet. Gasps from nearby passengers mixed with an uneasy laugh. The attendant's voice rang louder than it needed to, laced with mockery. "Oh, excuse me. Perhaps guests like you are used to eating off the floor." Jamie's breath caught, his throat tightening as if the words had lodged there. Veronica Hargrave's laughter cut through the moment, crisp and deliberate. She applauded the insult without moving her hands. The sound carried in her smirk and the gleam of approval in her eyes. Around them, a ripple of whispers and chuckles confirmed that cruelty, once spoken aloud had already become permission for others to follow. Eli shifted slightly, the tendons in his neck tightening, his fist curled against his thigh, but still he said nothing. He knew his brother's silence wasn't born of acceptance. It was the silence of someone trying desperately not to shatter. Jamie bent to retrieve the roll, but his trembling fingers stopped short. Instead, he straightened, swallowing the sting and staring at the tray table in front of him. The cruelty escalated with calculated precision. When Jamie asked for water, his voice was quiet, almost lost in the hum of the cabin. The attendant returned with a glass, but instead of placing it down, he tilted it abruptly. The liquid fizzed and spilled, soaking the open notebook, the ink bleeding into shapeless stains. Pages curled under the weight of the water, smearing numbers that had once been sharp. The wooden model engine Jamie had built with meticulous care, its delicate pieces sanded smooth and joined with glue bought from saved coins, absorbed the spill. Tiny drops clung to the edges, swelling the grain, threatening to warp the careful construction. The project he carried with pride now lay scarred, its fragile beauty disrupted in seconds. A sharp hiss of laughter rose from the front rows. Passengers who found amusement in another's humiliation. Others turned their heads toward the windows, suddenly fascinated by clouds they had ignored moments before. Their silence was not neutral. It was complicity, an agreement that the price of their own comfort was to watch cruelty unfold and do nothing. Jamie pressed his palm against the wet pages, trying in vain to stop the ink from spreading further. He felt as though his dream was dissolving in front of him, as fragile as the paper that now stuck together in ruined clumps. His chest tightened with shame, with the weight of being targeted not for anything he had done, but for who he was. The pin on his chest glimmered faintly in the light, the same pin that had drawn the storm upon him. Eli placed a steadying hand on Jamie's shoulder. The grip was firm, an anchor amid the chaos. He did not speak, but his presence carried strength, a reminder that even in humiliation, they were not alone. The fire in his eyes grew hotter, but he knew the right moment had not yet come. To lash out now would only feed those waiting to twist the narrative. The restraint cost him more than anger ever could. Around them, the cabin remained suspended in silence after the laughter faded. The attendants moved on to serve others, their smiles returning as though nothing had occurred. Veronica leaned slightly closer in her seat, her lips pursed in satisfaction. She had seen the pain settle in Jamie's shoulders, and to her it was victory. Yet what she and the others failed to realize was this humiliation, though sharp in the moment, does not last forever. The stains on paper cannot erase the brilliance of ideas that created them. The water that soaked the wooden model and could not wash away the hours of dedication carved into each line and joint. The attempt to break a spirit often reveals its resilience instead. For Jamie, the ruined notebook became a symbol of something larger. He realized that dreams cannot be defined by how they are treated in the eyes of others, but by the persistence to carry them through adversity. And for Eli, watching his brother's pain was a lesson written in fire silence. In the face of injustice is never neutrality, it is surrender. In that cabin, prejudice seemed triumphant, but history has shown that cruelty often overplays its hand. And when it does, the ones it tries to silence often rise with voices no insult can contain. The cabin, already tense, shifted into something darker. What had begun as sharp words and petty humiliations now turned into an attack aimed straight at identity itself. The attendant, who had already reduced Jamie's work to damp pages and warped wood, leaned in once more. His hand moved swiftly, a cruel gesture rehearsed in silence. With 2 fingers, he tore the rainbow pin from Jamie's chest. The tiny metal snapped free, clattering onto the carpeted floor. Its color dulled under the dim cabin lights. The sound was small, but in that moment it echoed louder than the engines outside. It was a declaration that this space, the polished aisles, the gleaming seats, the sanctity of the sky was not meant for them. The attendant's voice carried high, designed for every passenger to hear. This is not the place to flaunt symbols. People pay to fly, not to stare at cheap displays of pride. His tone was laced with scorn, but it was also calculated. He wanted the public humiliation, the approval of passengers who shared his disdain. Jamie's chest felt suddenly bare, as though the removal of that small pin had stripped him of more than cloth and metal. It was not just an accessory. It was the emblem of countless nights spent daring to believe he had a place in the world as himself. To see it tossed aside was to see his existence itself declared unworthy. His lips trembled, but no sound escaped. He pressed his hands protectively against the wooden model, the last thing untouched by cruelty. Though even that was damp and scarred, his silence was no longer just restraint, it was survival. Veronica Hargrave did not miss her moment. She leaned forward, her voice polished, sharp as glass. Exactly. I have attorneys who specialize in aviation law. Trust me, this airline will thank me later for pointing out such distractions. Her statement was less a comment, more a verdict, as though her wealth granted her authority to dictate who belonged in the sky and who did not. Her words landed heavily, especially because no one moved to contradict her. The other passengers stayed still, eyes trained on screens or tray tables, pretending to be immersed in anything but the cruelty unraveling in plain view. Their silence was suffocating, a reminder that discrimination thrives not only because of those who speak it, but also because of those who look away. Eli's arm tightened around his brother's shoulders. His grip was steady, firm, a quiet refusal to let Jamie shrink into nothing. His eyes burned with restrained fury, the muscles in his jaw locked against the weight of silence he carried. He knew there was a line, and it had been crossed. The bread on the floor could be ignored. The spilled water could be endured. But tearing away the symbol that represented identity was an assault too deep to let pass. Yet Eli held back, aware that anger must be tempered if it was to matter. The cabin's air felt heavier with every second. The humming of the engines outside was steady, indifferent, while inside, dignity had been trampled under the heels of arrogance and fear. Jamie's hands, though trembling, did not let go of the model. In the way he cradled it, there was something unspoken if they were determined to strip him of his pride. He would not surrender the work of his mind, even ruin. It was still his creation, his evidence that brilliance cannot be erased by cruelty. The moment lingered like a wound no one dared to treat, and in that space, the truth became clear. Symbols may seem small, a pin, a flag, a word, but to those who wear them, they are shields, reminders that they are not alone, that their identity has worth. To tear one away is not an act of tidying or order. It is an act of violence, an attempt to declare that someone's very being does not belong. For Eli and Jamie, the attack crystallized what they had known all along. Prejudice does not rest until it has tried to strip away dignity. And dignity, once threatened, can either break or harden. In the quiet aftermath of humiliation, they chose the latter. Their silence was not consent. It was a gathering storm. What those around them failed to recognize is that when you try to erase someone's identity, you only make their truth stronger. Just as the sky belongs to no single passenger, human worth belongs to no one's permission. The lesson hung there. Quiet but undeniable, the more cruelty tries to erase a symbol, the more powerful its meaning becomes. The cabin had been a theater of cruelty for too long, its silence pierced only by insults in the brittle laughter of Veronica Hargrave. Every moment tightened around Eli like a coil, compressing rage and patience into a single point. He could no longer allow silence to pass as survival. Slowly, deliberately, he rose from his seat. His posture was steady, his expression carved from steel. In his hands was a folder he had carried since boarding, its surface worn at the edges, yet marked with an unmistakable seal. When Eli spoke, his voice was low but carried with clarity across the cabin. Each word struck clean against the hush. "My name is Eli Monroe. I have been accepted into the National Young Pilots Training Program, funded and authorized by the Federal Aviation Administration." The weight of his announcement fell like a stone into water, sending shockwaves through the rows of leather seats. For a breath, no one moved. Those who had smirked before now froze, their expressions caught between disbelief and shame. The authority of the FAA was not abstract. It was the backbone of aviation itself, a gatekeeper of the skies. The same skies where Eli had just been dismissed as unworthy were, in truth, already opening to him by merit. Eli's steady gaze cut through the cabin, not seeking approval but demanding recognition. His words carried no bravado, only restrained fire. This was not about pride in status, but about dignity earned through persistence, discipline, and the right to belong in the very air that others thought that they could police. Before the passengers could recover, Jamie rose too. His cheeks were still wet, his voice quieter than his brother's, yet trembling with conviction. He lifted the sodden wooden model in both hands, the edges warped, the glue lines strained, but still intact. His eyes searched the room, then steadied forward. "I am Jamie Monroe. I am the youngest winner of the International Science Prize for Jet Propulsion Technology. My research is currently under review for integration into sustainable aviation fuel development." The cabin was struck into deeper silence than before, not the silence of complicity, but of revelation. Those who had laughed now stared wide-eyed, phones in hand but unable to raise them. The authority of titles and achievements had overturned every insult hurled at them, exposing the fragility of prejudice when confronted with undeniable accomplishment. Veronica's face hardened, her earlier confidence slipping into disbelief. The certainty she had wielded with her wealth no longer felt unshakable. Her laugh, once sharp and commanding, faltered into quiet. The attendant who had mocked so freely stood frozen, the pin he had discarded now glowing in memory brighter than any uniform insignia he wore. The power in the cabin had shifted. What had once been humiliation was now revelation. The same rainbow pin cast onto the floor was no longer just a symbol of defiance, but proof that those wearing it carried brilliance the world could not deny. For Eli and Jamie, the act of standing was more than reclaiming dignity. It was a declaration that truth cannot be hidden, that credentials earned with sweat and vision cannot be erased by disdain. They had not raised their voices to win sympathy. They had presented reality, one that spoke louder than prejudice ever could. And the lesson lingered in the heir's achievement should not be the price of respect. But when prejudice seeks to erase humanity, truth has the power to dismantle its cruelty. The brothers' revelation was not about proving worth to those who doubted. It was about reminding everyone that dignity is never granted by the powerful. It belongs to those who refuse to surrender it. The silence that followed Jamie's words stretched across the cabin like an unbroken cord. Passengers shifted uneasily in their seats, eyes darting between the two brothers who had been ridiculed and the attendant who now stood exposed in his cruelty. Then, from the front of the aircraft, the sound of footsteps, calm, deliberate, and heavier than any insult that had come before. The cockpit door opened, and the captain himself stepped into the aisle. His uniform carried the quiet authority of thousands of hours in the air. His gaze swept across the cabin before fixing on Eli. Recognition flickered immediately. The captain's voice was firm yet warm, cutting through the tension without effort. Eli Monroe, I signed off on your name just weeks ago. I remember the file. One of the most promising candidates I have ever seen. The cabin erupted in hushed whispers. The confirmation was undeniable. I was not just a passenger enduring humiliation. He was a pilot in training, someone whose future rested in the very skies these passengers were flying through. The authority of the captain's words bent the atmosphere, turning scorn into awe. Then his eyes turned to Jamie. The captain's attention lingered on the warped wooden model still cradled in the boy's hands. A faint smile crossed his face. And you must be the Monroe whose propulsion report I read in the journals. Impressive work. I did not expect to see its creator here, carrying the model himself. Jamie's throat tightened, not with humiliation this time, but with stunned gratitude. The recognition was real, and it struck deeper than any insult could reach. The attendant who had mocked them shifted backward, his confidence unraveling. The captain's tone grew sharper. You are relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. Your behavior dishonors this uniform and this airline. Gasps rippled through the rows. To see power redirected toward justice was a shock few had expected. As for Veronica Hargrave, the billionaire whose voice had sparked the spiral of cruelty, her defiance flickered under the weight of an authority she could not buy. The captain's order came clear and precise. You will disembark at the next available stop for disruptive and discriminatory conduct. The silence of the cabin was shattered by the rustle of phones raised to record. Screens glowed, capturing every word, every reaction. Within hours, the footage would flood social media. Headlines would spread across the world. Two brothers, targeted for who they are, transform humiliation into history at 30,000 feet. The story could no longer be silenced. The rainbow pin that had been tossed to the floor became the image replayed on every screen. A symbol not of weakness, but of resilience. As the flight resumed, Eli and Jamie finally sat back in their seats by the window. The clouds outside rolled endlessly, but inside the cabin, the stares had changed. No longer dismissive. They were reverent, tinged with the shame of those who had once looked away. For the first time that day, Jamie rested his notebook on the tray table without fear of it being destroyed. Eli leaned back, his expression calm, though his eyes still carried the storm that had burned within him. The lesson lingered not just for the passengers, but for anyone who would see the story. Prejudice thrives in silence, but when truth is spoken, when dignity is claimed, even the most hostile spaces can be transformed. Respect should never depend on titles or achievements, yet sometimes it takes revelation to dismantle arrogance. The Monroe brothers had not just defended themselves, they had forced an entire cabin, and soon the world, to confront its complicity. And now, to you listening, if you had been there in that cabin, would you have stayed silent, or would you have spoken out? Comment your thoughts below, because your voice matters more than you think. This is Heart Stories. Subscribe, share, and keep watching, because stories like these prove that no matter how high prejudice tries to fly, truth will always have the wings to rise higher.